Our speaker today is Ted Pappas, Executive Editor and Development Director for the Encyclopedia Britannica. And no, they don't print it anymore. It's an online service, educational service, and so he partners with educational institutions across the country, libraries, schools, et cetera, et cetera. He is also, they stopped printing in 2012. He is also, they printed one more book. I don't know about you guys, but when I was young and I had my set of encyclopedias, every year I got a yearbook, right? And I loved it, but I got a yearbook. And so the Encyclopedia Britannica has been around a while. So last year, Ted edited the final Encyclopedia Britannica yearbook, the 250th yearbook from Encyclopedia Britannica. There's some out front afterwards if you'd like to buy them. He's already sold one. I'm going to give one to my grandsons. And he's also written a book called True Grit, Tales of Perseverance, which is just fascinating stuff. So he's going to talk about all of that. I wanted just to throw that out there. You may have seen him on television. He's been on everything from the Today Show to the BBC. He's quite an authority. I'm delighted, and came down to visit us from Chicago. I'm delighted to introduce Ted Pappas.
Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I might add that I'm very proud of my oldest boy. I'm proud of all my kids. I have 3 kids, but my oldest boy is also in the service. He is a second lieutenant in the chemical unit stationed at Fort Leonard Wood. And I talked with him a couple of days ago, and he said, I'm going to volunteer for my first deployment. I'm not quite sure where that's going to be, but I'm very proud of him as well. So let me start with just a couple of simple propositions for you. That passion plus perseverance equals grit, and the second, that grit in the face of great change and adversity spells success. Those are the simple lessons at the heart of my 2 new books. On the left, as John was talking about, is the last yearbook of Britannica. It's our special 250th collector's edition version of Britannica, and in there I highlight our extraordinary past, talk about our present, and commission 33 special essays by notable folks around the world on their vision of the present and their vision of the future. So, for example, Martin Scorsese is a big fan of Britannica. He has a wonderful essay in there that I commissioned on film preservation. He's very concerned about the fact that 80% of silent films have disintegrated and are gone forever. 50% of films before 1950 are gone forever. Other essays in there that I commissioned, Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright, James Baker, wonderful essays on the future of democracy. And I commissioned a very interesting piece on cyberbullying, a very important topic we all need to be concerned about in the digital age, written by Monica Lewinsky. Monica was the very first target of cyberbullying because the scandal she was a part of was the very first scandal to break on that new medium of mass communication in the 90s called the internet. So she has a very interesting perspective on cyberbullying. So that's in the anniversary volume. And my second book, as John kindly mentioned, was True Grit, Classic Tales of Perseverance, in which I highlight how 10 history makers have changed the world in their own special way by overcoming great turmoil and troubles in their private and professional lives. But those are the 2 books that I'll be referencing a bit today. Now, when Britannica was founded in 1768, the world was a radically different place, obviously. But most obviously, there was no United States. The United States didn't exist. Lights, cameras, phones, and cars didn't exist. Trains didn't exist. And Napoleon and Lincoln, they had yet to be born, to put it in perspective. But Britannica already did exist, and it was already sowing the seeds of a publishing phenomenon that continues to this day in digital form at Britannica.com and elsewhere 250 years later. Now, I'm often asked, since the encyclopedia is the oldest continuously published and revised work in the English language, is Britannica the company then also the oldest continuously operated business in the world? And the answer is no. There are actually a number of businesses that are older than Britannica, and they tend to be hotels, inns, pubs, and bars. So it seems the oldest continuously operated enterprises in human existence are places where you can get drunk and places where you can sleep it off. Not quite sure what we make of that, but that's the reality. What you see in this slide here is the actual first edition of Britannica that we have in our archives in Chicago that I took out and thumbed through for CNN for the program next week, a 3-volume set. And what's most interesting about the set, it's missing an article. In the M volume of the 3 volumes, there's a 43-page gap. And the article that's missing, is the article on midwifery. Now, childbirth in the 18th century was the #1 killer of women. And to fulfill Britannica's mission of bringing reliable and useful information, not to a narrow educated class, but to the masses, Britannica really wanted to convey solid, concrete information on how to deal with difficult pregnancies while also saving the life of the mother. The article, however, caused a storm of protest. And the protest was not because of the content, not the text of the article, but rather the illustrations. Britannica's 3 pages of illustrations were the most graphic images of childbirth and a woman's anatomy yet ever distributed in England and Scotland at that time. Some parents were outraged. They threatened to sue Britannica. And the King George III himself, who was not yet preoccupied with that little dust-up that would come years later called the American Revolution. This is before the American Revolution. He was outraged as well. He denounced Britannica and instructed all loyal followers of the crown to immediately destroy the offensive Britannica article. And the fact that our own first edition set in our archives in Chicago is missing this article leads us to believe that either the original owner was one of these outraged parents or a loyal follower of the crown who followed the king's advice and destroyed the article. Now, I mention this because Britannica's influence over 250 years has been exerted not through just text, but also through illustrations. And I thought you might like a couple more examples of this. On the left and the right, you'll see 2 illustrations from Britannica's 11th edition from 1910 and 1911. And in 1915, the Coca-Cola Company issued a challenge to all of its bottlers nationwide. They said, come up with a new bottle for Coca-Cola, one so distinct that one could figure out that you're grabbing for a bottle of Coca-Cola even in the dark, or if you're reaching in the dark into your refrigerator. And so that was the challenge that went out. And the Root Bottle Company in Terre Haute, Indiana, wanted to participate in this challenge. So they sent someone in Terre Haute, Indiana, they sent one of their employees to the library, and he turned to Britannica. And he thought, wouldn't it be interesting to design the new bottle after the 2 main ingredients in Coca-Cola? Those 2 main ingredients being the cola nut or the coca leaf, which is the main ingredient in cocaine. And traces of cocaine were in Coca-Cola all the way up to about 1929, when the last remnants of cocaine was removed from the recipe, and we begin during the Prohibition time, get this distinction between hard liquor and soft drinks. So he thought this would be a clever idea, but instead of pulling up the cola nut or the coca leaf, he pulled up the Britannica article and the illustration of the cocoa pod, the main ingredient in chocolate. Nevertheless, he was interested in the shape. He took it back, and the bulging, ribbed Britannica illustration of the cocoa pod became the iconic bottle shape for Coca-Cola. Another sign that accident really can be the mother of invention many times. Now, 10 years later, a literary magazine in New York was ready to launch its debut issue, and they too were looking for an image to represent their company. And they sent, once again, they sent someone to the library, and their art director looked at the costume article that you see on the right, one of the illustrations from our 1910 issue. And sure enough, they found this top-hatted, suited, cane-holding dandy on the right, and became the exact image and symbol of the New Yorker magazine, now famous the world over. Again, 2 examples of how Britannica has exerted its influence, not just through text, but through images. Now, Britannica, as a startup company in the 18th century, faced challenges like any startup company. They had challenges. I already mentioned the childbirth illustrations. But we also had an issue with our first editor, William Smelly. He did a magnificent job editing the first edition. But after that was finished, Britannica's owners announced that they were going to add a new type of entry to the second edition of Britannica, because the Britannica's owners noticed that people were beginning to get their information from a new literary type. And it's always important for publishers, especially today in the digital age, to know what kind of information do people want and how do they want to receive it. It was no different in the 18th century. And Britannica's owners realized they were getting their information through this increasingly popular type of article of information called the biography. So Britannica announced it was going to add biographies to the second edition. This was a controversial move in the 18th century, so much so that our editor, William Smellie, immediately resigned in protest. He thought encyclopedias should be only for conveying practical information and the scientific principles of the world around us, and it should never deal with the day-to-day matters of a single person's life, be that person a king or a Kardashian-type celebrity figure. It had no place in an encyclopedia. So Britannica was left high and dry without an editor on the verge of its second edition. So they found a new editor. James Tytler was a wonderful editor. He was quite a man. He was quite a common fixture in the pubs around Edinburgh. He was quite the philanderer, and he was quite an editor as well. But he was also a daredevil balloonist, and had an awful lot of experiments with hot air ballooning about that time in the 1770s or so. And he nearly killed himself many times doing it. But he's gone down in history, and Randy, you might know this, as the first Briton ever to fly. So he was our editor. But he also had another passion other than Britannica that caused problems for us. He was also a political rabble-rouser. And when he wasn't writing for Britannica, he was also writing political screeds denouncing the king and demanding more power for the people in Parliament. Well, King George III was just finishing up being upset with us over our childbirth illustrations, who now turned his attention to swiftly issuing an arrest warrant on Britannica's editor. So now there's an arrest warrant on Britannica's editor, and James Tytler says, I have no interest in being in prison, and so he left not just Scotland, he left all of the UK and ended up in Salem, Massachusetts, where he drank himself to death a few years later. But once again, Britannica was left without an editor, and I mention these things because these are the types of things startup companies deal with today, as well as in the 18th century, no different. Today, our headquarters are in Chicago, in that 7-story brown brick building you see nestled between skyscrapers. We've been an American company since 1901. We've been headquartered in Chicago since 1932, and we've been in this building on the Chicago River since 2005. And if you know Chicago, the far left horizontal wide building is a merchandise mart, and the far right, the tall skyscraper, is the Trump Tower. And this is a very common panoramic shot you'll see in news broadcasts, TVs, and in films. And there's 2 incidents, I think, in our building's history that are worth pointing out to you. Number one, in July of 1915, a year after our building was constructed, which is called the Reed Murdock building, our building was the site of the second worst maritime disaster in American history. It's often been called the Titanic of the working class. On that day in July 1915, the workers of the Western Electric Company were supposed to go out on an excursion on Lake Michigan across to Michigan City, Indiana. 2,500 passengers, a lot of women and children, and entire families of employees of Western Electric. But as they boarded the Eastland steamliner, naturally they went to the top deck, and they naturally went to the far railing. And as more and more and hundreds of folks began to board the steamliner, the boat began to list and lean and list and lean until finally it capsized. 844 people died in the Chicago River outside our headquarters that day. As the bodies were pulled out, they were brought to the lower level of our building where we have our archives. And our archives were used as a temporary morgue for identifying the bodies. And it's for that reason that if you take tours, boat or bus tours of Chicago, you'll often, if they go by our building, they'll say, here is the most haunted building in all of Chicago, because of this fact that we were used as a morgue. I have not, by the way, ever seen a ghost in our archives, not yet. So it was a very momentous occasion on that day in 1915. Interesting also, there was a 20-year-old employee of the Western Electric Company who was supposed to be on board that ship that day, but he was running late. He arrived just minutes after the boat had capsized, consequently saving his life. The newspapers the next day nevertheless reported him as dead. And that 20-year-old employee was George Halas, the founder of the Chicago Bears and one of the pioneers of the National Football League. So you kind of wonder how maybe American football, the landscape of American football, might look different if George Halas had actually perished in the Chicago River that day. A second event I think is interesting to point out is in 1926. That's during a time when Chicago was bustling and the population was exploding. And particularly the streets at that time were exploding and getting busier because of that new novel method of mass transportation known as the automobile. And as a result, on the west side of the building, which is LaSalle Street, if you know Chicago, LaSalle Street needed to be widened into 4 lanes. As a result, the owners of the Reed Murdock building, our building, had a bit of a predicament. They said you can either tear the building down or you can modify it. They chose to modify the building so it would survive. And if you look closely, to the left of the clock tower, there are only 5 vertical bays of windows. To the right of the clock tower, there are 6 vertical bays of window. They simply sliced out an entire row, recreated the end cap, and then unless you're looking carefully, you really don't even notice it. It was so beautifully done. But if you do notice it, you can see the symmetry of the building is completely off. From my perspective, though, for a company like Britannica, who's headquartered there, there's no better symbol and metaphor for success than what this building has gone through, because they had a challenge. You can either adapt and survive and persevere, or you can refuse to adapt to changing circumstances and die. The building chose to adapt and has lived on into the 21st century, much like Britannica has had to do many times over 250 years. Britannica is doing extremely well today. We're an all-digital publisher, and just for your own edification, we have 7 offices around the world. We're headquartered in Chicago. We have offices in New York, Springfield, Massachusetts, where our sister company, I'm sure you know, a company we own, Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And last night, by the way, at the Spelling Bee, if any of you noticed, the Spelling Bee was quite a finals. We were one of the sponsors of the prizes for the Spelling Bee winners. And my colleagues from Massachusetts were in Maryland last night giving away cash awards to each of the winners of the Spelling Bee. They received from us, from Scripps, they received $50,000, and from Britannica, they received $2,500 cash and 3 years of free access to all of Merriam-Webster's and Britannica's educational products. So we're very proud to be part of that. We also have offices in London, Tel Aviv, Israel, Tokyo, and Sydney. Our educational products are now used in 88 countries of the world. We're exceptionally global. And our websites are gaining and garnering 5 billion page views a year, which is 400 plus million page views every month. So we're doing actually extremely well. Here are some of the brands associated with Britannica today and some of the companies we have partnerships with. I mentioned Merriam-Webster is our sister company we own, and the far right, Britannica Knowledge Systems, is one of the companies we own in Tel Aviv. And Britannica Knowledge Systems provides the learning and training platform for training the service and maintenance staffs and crews in the aeronautics industry. And some of their clients are NASA, Boeing, British Airways, the US Army. We have new contracts with the Canadian Air Force and the Israeli Army as well. We have very soon Britannica Content, because the encyclopedia, by the way, contrary to Wikipedia, is the largest fact-checked general database in the world. You will now soon, whether we like it or not, this is the development that's coming, you're going to have Britannica Content speaking to you from your microwave and your oven and your stove and your refrigerator soon through Samsung voice-activated systems. And also Britannica Content will be in our voice-activated systems with games through Amazon Alexa. The ND you see there is NetDragon. We just finished this deal last week. NetDragon is one of the most dynamic online mobile companies in China. right now. We have a very interesting program in the works with them. We also are doing educational programs with the ministries of education or with the national libraries in Egypt, Libya, Nigeria, Ghana, Lebanon, South Africa, and Qatar. And in many of these cases, we're producing the educational aids and material in English, and then they are translated into the native language, or often they're being now translated into Arabic. One partnership I wanted to mention in particular is YouTube. Many social media sites today are suffering from a credibility of content problem, right? Misinformation, fake news on their site. YouTube is no different with a lot of the misinformation in the community uploaded videos. So YouTube came to us late last year and said, let's partner with Britannica to help surface credible, reliable, well-written information and try to do something about it. YouTube said, we're not going to stifle or censor people from uploading their videos to YouTube, but we want to surface and bring to the fore reliable, credible information. And that's what they've done as a result of this partnership. So now if you go to YouTube and do a search on a topic around which a lot of conspiracy theories have long swirled, like the moon landing, believe it or not, or the Kennedy assassination, you will now in the shaded box get the Britannica article first, or the Britannica article under the video as a wonderful background or summary of the topic that you can read first before launching in to the community uploaded videos of unknown quality. Again, no one's having their First Amendment rights to upload and have free communication. But again, let's surface reliable information where we can and offer it to people in an easy way. Dan Brown, the novelist, most famous for the Da Vinci Code, is a man who has noticed how well Britannica has been doing in the digital space. And in his latest novel, he actually has a passage about Britannica where he says, "The fax machine has gone the way of the dodo bird, and the iPhone will survive only if it keeps outperforming its competition. Typewriters and steam engines died in changing environments, but the Encyclopedia Britannica evolved, its cumbersome 32-volume set, sprouting digital feet, and like the lungfish, which can survive on both land as well as in water, expanding into uncharted territory where it now thrives." It's a wonderful passage, completely unexpected to us when we happen upon that in his novel. But what Dan Brown understands is what I was talking about in the beginning, of the power of perseverance and adaptability in the face of great adversity and change. Britannica has done that. Someone else that understands exactly what Dan Brown was getting at was Steve Jobs, who wrote, "I'm convinced that about half of what separates successful entrepreneurs from unsuccessful ones is pure perseverance." Very interesting. And I can't think of a better example of the power of perseverance than in the 10 individuals I highlight in my other book, True Grit, Classic Tales of Perseverance. Now, I think you probably recognize the 10 individuals I cover in the book. On the top row there, you see Madeleine Albright, our first woman Secretary of State and our former ambassador to the United Nations. She also, what a lot of people don't realize, is before she got into government work, she worked in our advertising department at Encyclopedia Britannica back in 1960. And of course, 1960 was very much the time and period of time like the Mad Men TV show of that era. And you could certainly ask women applying for jobs questions that you would never get away with in an HR setting today. But when she came, and she tells a similar story about this experience in one of her autobiographies, but it's lore and famed in stories at Britannica. When she applied for the job, she was grilled by a male executive at Britannica. And he point blank asked her, "Mrs. Albright, do you plan on getting pregnant?" Again, a question is perfectly legal at that time, but you can never get away with that today, to which Madeleine replied, "Not at this moment, thank you." To her right, you see Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross. To the right, then, you see Theodore Geisel. Who knows who Theodore, remember who Theodore Geisel is, better known as Dr. Seuss. Fascinating life. A lot of folks don't know how he struggled to make it in children's literature. And after he made it, was making millions, he suffered a horrific experience where his wife committed suicide, partially because of something he did. and the guilt he felt over that and how he persevered to continue his career is something worth telling. Very interesting story. Then you have Walt Disney, and to his right, you see Marie Curie, the first two-time winner of the Nobel Prize in both chemistry and physics at the turn of the 20th century, the first woman ever to win a Nobel Prize, and someone, too, who's often, always, right, mentioned in our history books is with her work in radium and radioactivity, et cetera. But she suffered a horribly embarrassing sex scandal at the turn of the 20th century. As a woman in an almost completely male-dominated field of the hard sciences at that time, they're still male-dominated, but at the turn of the 20th century they really were. And how she persevered through a very embarrassing scandal is something that doesn't often get told, but it's worth telling. On the bottom row, you see Thomas Edison. To his right, you see Ian Fleming, creator of one of the most enduring characters in all of literature and film, James Bond. To his right, Ruth Handler, the creator of the Barbie doll. She's famous for creating the Barbie doll, but what she did with the second half of her life when she lost the Mattel company and when she was stricken with breast cancer, what she did in the second half of her life, recreating herself and her company with a brand new company, is phenomenal. And Ruth Handler is a hero to many women today, but not for Barbie. It's for what she did in the second half of her life. Lincoln we have, and then Joe Louis, the boxing heavyweight champion of the world in the 30s and 40s, who gave so much. We were talking about World War II earlier. He was a hero in recruiting and particularly African-American troops during the segregated era of World War II. But he truly was the first national American hero among both whites and blacks. And his life story is really quite interesting. So what I'd like to leave you with today is just a short passage from my book that kind of summarizes what these 10 individuals have in common and what makes them really so special. How did the great men and women who changed the world actually do it? Were they simply smarter or more talented and privileged than the rest of us, enjoying higher IQs, superior educations, better skills and connections? Was it just a matter of greater genius, talent, gifts, and opportunities? The simple answer is no. For beneath the veneer of their famous accomplishments, we find frequent battles with adversity, serial setbacks and defeats, and personal and professional hardships they endured along the way. And it's here, amid the dark underside of achievement that is seldom illuminated by our history books and seldom taught to our children, that we find the special quality they possessed in common that connects their life stories and that paved their way to greatness and world influence. And that special quality is that life-changing mix of passion and perseverance, commonly known as grit. For these 10 masters of grit, merely going through the motions was never a mirror of their lives, and ignoring their life mission or quitting in pursuit of it was never a serious long-term option. For them, inactivity was a toxin, and drifting rudderless at sea was a fate worse than drowning. For they constantly strove and stepped and worked and pushed on, and by staying engaged and in motion, literally and figuratively, physically and psychologically, they were able in the end to transcend their failures, cope with their struggles, overcome their disappointments, and successfully achieve their life's mission, changing the world in historic ways. But these masters of grit were not immune to fears of failure or to moments of self-doubt. In fact, as the reader will see, quite a few of these individuals suffered repeated bouts of depression and so-called nervous breakdowns. They were all too human in this regard. But it was during these very times of crisis, when their character and convictions were challenged to the core, that they once again distinguished themselves. Rejecting the role of victim, they would never fully surrender to the devil of doubt or allow such a demon to haunt them for long. They refused to be permanently disabled by defeat, paralyzed by self-pity, or derailed from pursuing the destiny that brought meaning to their lives. They understood that scars are a sign of where we have been, not where we are going. And so through all the setbacks and disappointments they encountered, they could tap an inner strength, a special resolve, and find the critical reason to get up the next morning and trudge on in pursuit of their life's mission. And in the end, what we find in the lives of these masters of grit is the locus of the human capacity to rebound and push on. Their passion to succeed, their singleness of purpose in the face of repeated failure, and the sense of urgency with which they lived their lives can inspire us all, renewing hope and faith in our own ability to succeed, to endure, and even to change the world in our own special way. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Ted. We have time for some questions. I have a question about that cover.
Sure.
And the lady who invented the Barbie doll.
Yes.
I have my hearing aids on, but I must have missed it. In general, what did she do with the second half of her life?
There were some accountants at Mattel that did some funny accounting practices to get the company through difficult times in the early 1970s. The government found out about it, and they were called on the carpet for it, and she was forced to leave Mattel as head of the company. She was then stricken with cancer, with breast cancer. So she had lost her company. Her health was failing. She had a radical mastectomy. Survived that in an awful lot of pain, particularly back then with the procedures in the very early days of the 1970s. And she decided, after her surgery, she wanted a prosthetic breast. And there were none available. And the only ones on the market available were created by men. And they were horribly uncomfortable. And so she created a woman. It was run by women, a lot of breast cancer survivors, and they created the very first realistic feeling prosthetic breasts for cancer survivors called Nearly Me, a company that still survives and still going strong today. And for that reason, as she liked to say, because of the controversy over Barbie's breasts, which continued to be a controversy even to this day, it was a controversy in the 1950s when she tried to bring Barbie to market. All the male executives, and even her husband, said, "You're crazy. No mother in the 1950s is going to buy a doll with breasts for their child." It had never been done, and Ruth said it can be done because girls are beginning to look and they want something to use and to play with that envisions their future as a young lady, and they said it can be done. And so she faced really adversity from the very start at Mattel all the way through the end of her period after getting breast cancer. And as she liked to say, I've lived my life from breast to breast.
Thank you.
If you look at your employees in 1819, 1919, and 2019, what would be the similarities and differences of their skill sets?
I think there'd be more similarities than differences. Obviously, the differences would be the kind of training they have, and particularly in the digital world today. But it's a passion for knowledge, good writing, reliable information, and disseminating that not to a narrow educated class, but to the masses. That's the mission. In fact, very interesting, and I pointed this out to CNN, the very first sentence on page 1 of volume 1 of our first edition says this: utility ought to be the principal intention of every publication. That's sentence 1 in volume 1 of Britannica in 1768, and that really is our mission statement to this day. If the product isn't useful, it's of no use. And so therefore, I think all of us have always been committed to that, including our founding fathers back in the 18th century, useful information that you can convey to the masses and they can rely on.
So the question that I have is, those 10 people that you have over there, how did failure shape their character?
It challenged them to either give up on their dreams or to change, adapt, survive, and persevere in order to be successful. And these 10 special people chose not to give up. It's as simple as that. I mean, in the chapter in Madeleine Albright, I point out that one of the seminal chapters in her life was when her husband came home one day at a time. Her husband, by the way, he's still alive. Her ex-husband, a very wealthy, prominent Chicago family and journalist. Part of Northwestern University is named after the Medill School of Journalism, is named after his family, etc. So they were very wealthy. She had 3 academic degrees, 3 beautiful daughters, making a lot of money, her husband was. They came from money. They had 3 homes. She seemingly, as she said, was living the dream. And over breakfast one morning, I believe it was 1982, over coffee, he said, "I'm leaving you for a younger woman. She's younger and she's prettier." She was devastated. And I point that out because she could have simply whiled away her days very comfortably, multi-million-dollar divorce settlement. She didn't have to do anything else for the rest of her life. She was not involved heavily in the field that she was later. She could have simply grown bitter, with rage and resentful, and instead, within 12 years of that morning, when he announced he was leaving her, she was the first woman Secretary of State. Within 12 years. That's an amazing turnaround. And again, she certainly did not have to take that path, but she did. And each one of these, Ian Fleming, was an absolute, wonderful, repeated failure at absolutely everything he did in his life until 1930, until his 30s and World War II, when he got involved with intelligence during World War II, and it changed his life. But a lot of these folks, Lincoln, the litany of failures that Lincoln went through and still persevered, the bouts of depression, some self-doubt, but ultimately not so much that they were paralyzed from still continuing on with their life's mission, and that's the key. Thank you all.